Hello, a very good morning to you and a warm welcome to today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. President Vladimir Zelensky says 2 Ukrainians have died in Israel after Hamas assault. Explosions, destruction mounts in Israel as airstrikes continue on Gaza. Fighting escalates, casualties also on the rise after Hamas attack. Plus, world leaders condemn Hamas attack on Israel as Iran, Hezbollah pledge support to Palestine. Welcome to the program today. We will be incidentally focusing a lot on the issues in the Middle East concerning Israel and Gaza, and as it, of course, affects the war in Ukraine, if that is a possibility. Now, the war in Israel began over the weekend after the Palestine militant group Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, taking them by surprise. Explosions and subsequent black smoke will be seen across the Gaza City skyline up to this morning as Israel continued retaliatory airstrikes in response to Saturday's attack by Hamas. More than 1,100 people have been killed on both sides after the massive attack. 36 hours after the latest hostilities began, rockets are still being fired from Gaza into southern Israel, as at the time of this report. The United Nations says Israel's retaliatory airstrikes have displaced 123,000 Palestinians in Gaza, with close to 74,000 seeking refuge in schools. In the meantime, Israel's President Isaac Herzog has vowed for victory a day after Hamas fighters rampaged through Israeli border towns, marking the country's deadliest in decades, maybe even in history. Israel battered Palestinians with airstrikes in Gaza on Sunday, with hundreds reportedly killed on both sides, the spiraling violence threatening to start a major new war in the Middle East. Earlier on Sunday, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with Security Cabinet to get updates on the situation in southern and northern Israel. Hamas on Saturday say the attack was driven by what it calls escalated Israeli attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and against militants, that is, against Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Meanwhile, Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Robert Wood has reiterated U.S. support to Israel, but warned that the ongoing conflict could escalate, calling it a very tragic situation. He called upon the global community to strongly condemn the unprovoked invasion. Speaking to reporters after an emergency meeting at the United Nations Security Council, the United Arab Emirates Ambassador to the UN, Lana Nusabian, also the UAE was using its regional ties to try to de-escalate the conflict.
I don't want to get into what was really discussed in the briefing, but there were a good number of countries that condemned Hamas attacks. They're obviously not all. I don't really want to get into that. I think you could probably figure out one of them without me saying anything. Look, the situation is still fluid and very dangerous, and we've got to, we're working hard, as I know other countries in the region are, to try to prevent this conflict from spreading. So, yeah, it's a very difficult time. Our thoughts are with, obviously, the government and the people of Israel right now. It's just a very tragic situation. It's ongoing, as I said. And it's important that the global community strongly condemn this unprovoked invasion and the terrorist attacks and activities that have taken place and are taking place. We condemn civilians who are hurt or killed anywhere in the world. That goes without saying. What's important now is that the international community needs to show its solidarity with Israel. We have Israel's back fully as the United States. The condemnation of Hamas needs to continue until they end this violent terrorist activity against the Israeli people.
Now, let's hear from the Palestinian UN ambassador, Riyad Mansour. He says that Israel's assault on Gaza will not accomplish its stated goals of destroying Hamas and ensuring its own security, in his words. He said this ahead of a closed-door meeting of the UN Security Council. Home to some 2 million people, the Gaza Strip has been run by Hamas since it seized control of the territory in 2007. Its economy has long been choked by a blockade imposed by Israel with Egypt's help, according to this report.
Israel keeps saying the blockade and repeated assaults on Gaza are to destroy Hamas, military capabilities, and ensure security. Clearly and expectedly, its blockade and assaults accomplished neither. When Israel now tries to justify yet another assault by the same faulty premise, no one should say or do anything to encourage it down this path. We know only too well that the messages about Israel's right to defend itself will be interpreted by Israel as license to kill. Israel expects and demands political and military support while advancing goals that are fundamentally at odds with international legitimacy and consensus. Its policies are an assault on our humanity, on international law, on peace, and are a threat for its own people. Can those supporting Israel ignore its colonialist and racist agenda? That would be self-defeating. A different path is possible. I repeat, a different path is possible. But it cannot ignore the lives and rights of the Palestinian people.
Now, for the Israelis, we don't have the Israeli side from the Israeli UN ambassador, but I can tell you that he appeared before or shortly before the Palestine ambassador to the United Nations, and he said that it was an unfathomable war crime, the incidents that happened over the weekend with Hamas assaulting Israel. He described the incident as unprecedented. He took pictures, still pictures, of some of the events that happened at that incident, including that of Israeli hostages, Israeli citizens being dragged away from Israel into Gaza. He said, amongst other things, Israel has a right to defend itself. That's from the Israeli UN ambassador. Now, at a campaign rally in Iowa on Saturday, former President Donald Trump says the Israeli attack was made because the U.S. is perceived as being weak and ineffective. Gunmen from the Palestinian group Hamas rampaged through Israeli towns on Saturday, killing more than 700 people and escaping with hostages in by far the deadliest day of violence in Israel since the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. More than 230 Gazans at the least were also killed when Israel responded with one of its most devastating days of retaliatory strikes. Back in the day, took a softer approach to things. And now that Hamas, which is designated a terrorist organization, is controlling the government, Israel, do you think, obviously had their hands tied and they have to respond in the manner which they are doing at this time?
Well, I don't see how they could not respond as strongly as possible. They were caught by surprise. Their own people were going to be very, very angry. The fact that this was on such a scale that the Israeli intelligence wasn't aware of it. I think that they really have to have a strong response politically, internally. I think that internally, it's simply something that cannot be tolerated. The political administration couldn't possibly stand by on that, and so the retaliation is massive. The killing is massive on a one-day scale. I don't know that the Ukraine-Russia war has had so many people killed in a single day as Israel just did. So, and I should say the Palestinians as well. So it's is retaliation justified? I think it was inevitable, and I think it had to happen.
The Palestinians, no sooner had this happened than the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations saying that he was calling for a meeting of the Arab League. And no sooner had the attack happened did Hezbollah fire shots into Israel. Are the Palestinians deliberately trying to cause a bigger conflict by inviting other nations to participate in this war deliberately?
I don't know. And I think wiser men than I need to answer that. But on the other hand, it is, I think, a sign of desperation. And so I think that they're looking for allies as much as possible. It's hard to imagine Iran was not involved, for instance. But since our own Secretary of State has said he has yet to find the proof of that, then I step back from that at the time. But I think the Palestinians are looking for any type of allies that they can have at this stage. It is a desperate situation, and therefore it has to be addressed. The statement, as I was just watching it as you were, from the Palestinian ambassador, is that it does have, a sign of hope in the sense of a glimmer of, in the sense that calling for dialogue. So I think that's important.
If the Iranians were not involved, certainly the sophistication, which the Israelis have admitted themselves in the coordinated attack, speaks to the argument that they had help from outside. And they used drones to attack tanks. And these drones, the latest we've seen of that sort of drone attack was with between Ukraine and Russia. So how much of that do you think is a part of, as what people have said, and the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, has said that the $6 billion unfrozen Iranian funds from their oil deal with South Korea was partially what possibly helped the Palestinians to do this, because obviously the Iranians, according to him, are supporting the Palestinians.
Well, certainly the Iranians are supporting the Palestinians. They've stated that as such, so that's beyond question. The $6 billion, though, we were obligated to release that a long time ago. That was by agreement. We've held on to that. So it was a matter of eventually releasing that according to legal agreement, and that's what the United States did. So I'm not going to condemn the Biden administration for doing what they were obligated to do by law some time ago, and to say that then that was used as part of the attack, I think, is outrageous. And of course, political candidates at this stage will use anything they can to advance their own causes. So I think that in that part, I think Mr. Trump was wrong. The other part of it, of course, is how much is the weakness of the United States seen as a trigger for this? And I don't think that that's a valid criticism either. I think that the Palestinians would have, Hamas, I should say, Hamas would have done this in any case. It doesn't matter in that regard. Whether the United States, I think it's already known that the United States would support Israel beyond any doubt. So I think that Mr. Trump's arguments are spacious. I think in some ways they're outrageous and they're predictable.
I see your point, but the wider criticism is that, to read between the lines, that the Biden administration is soft on Iran. And given the Iranian regime and the antecedents, that should not be the case. Given, as you have said, that as an obligation for them to unfreeze the $6 billion. But it was easy for critics of the Biden administration and the Democrats to hop on the bandwagon and say, you're going to give $6 billion to these guys who we can't trust with their nuclear intentions and what have you, and their support of all things against Israel. You see my point?
No, I see the point, and I also see that in a reasonable political argument why that would be the case. I think Mr. Trump stepped over the line on that and used it for his own personal gain. It would have been very, very difficult for any number of people, including myself, to release that $6 billion, quite frankly. But it was a legal obligation that we've had for many, many years. So it's the timing is unfortunate. The fact that it was tied to release of hostages, I think, was also unfortunate, to say the least, because I think that we should have been stronger on that regard as well. But nevertheless, it was a legal obligation that we've had for years and years. And I think the argument is, and your argument too, is a valid criticism.
This is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this program. But it's interesting to note that the atrocities that the Ukrainians accused the Russians of, for which we had little or no proof at all, by way of video or images, such as raping of some Ukrainian women, the kidnapping, and what have you, in a day, was published against the Palestinians by the Palestinian Hamas themselves. We must mention the images of children being dragged off into Gaza, images of women that looked as though they'd been assaulted, children that looked as though they'd been abused, or who were being abused. It was really horrible, these images. If the Hamas Palestinians say that they have a strategic objective, why did they go after soft targets, such as women, children, and the elderly? Why didn't they target only the military or the authorities of the Israelis?
They're the easiest targets. They're also the ones, those women and children are also the ones with other people will be sympathetic to, and so they have the highest leverage on. So I think it is outrageous. I think it's atrocious. I think Hamas is rightly, in this case, a terrorist organization, and it's again, the words that I used today seem to be, I think, a little weak. It's more than unfortunate. It's just simply outrageous.
Of course, this obviously is what reinforces the Israeli argument, the Israeli position that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hezbollah seems to be, obviously, are in support of Hamas. Do you fear that this conflict that Hezbollah will go as far as involving themselves more than they've done thus far?
I would think that they're on the edge of doing so. I think there's going to be pressure on them from the Hamas side to enter into it, but they've also been warned very clearly by Israel not to. And Hezbollah has admitted directly being supported by Iran. So if Hezbollah does enter, then I think it's going to be even a greater risk of war, and I think that's why everyone right now is scrambling to lessen that risk.
Now, Israel obviously has its work cut out for it in the days ahead. President Benjamin Netanyahu says that they should be prepared for a long and difficult war. It's too early to cast blame for obvious reasons, but the first thing everybody said when this happened was intelligence failure. How could this have happened? The scale with which it happened, the duration for which it was happening, all these videos that were being shot, and people from what looked like a ragtag army, guerrilla type situation, carrying people off on motorcycles, and there was not an Israeli soldier in sight. What does this say of what will happen in Israel after the war? In the days of the first incident, Yom Kippur, I think, was Golda Meir had to resign.
Right.
Does Benjamin Netanyahu have a very difficult period as prime minister after this?
Well, I think he'll have a difficult period for sure, but I don't think he's the type of person that is going to resign or take the blame for it himself. I just don't see him resigning. I think that he sees himself, and perhaps the majority of Israelis see it as the strong man capable of standing up to Hamas. So I don't see a resignation from Netanyahu on the forefront.
And indeed, that's not anything that the Israelis are talking about at this time. They're talking about unity, speaking to the press, leaders of the other parties who are having issues with the Netanyahu party were saying that this wasn't a time for factions it's a time for unity for the Israeli people. But one of the mayors in one of the cities in Israel spoke of the fact that this probably was precipitated by the Palestinians smelling weakness on the side of Israel, smelling blood, if you like, because of all the infighting that was going on, the judicial reform, what have you. A strike was supposed to happen, a demonstration this weekend before the attack happened, or while the attack was going on. There was supposed to be some sort of strike, but obviously that was called off. The Israelis now, do you see them in future days banding together and laying aside their differences?
Well, you know, nothing brings people together than being attacked as a group. And we go back to the Ukraine war also. The Ukraine had a very strong split. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, then Ukrainians came together very, very clearly over the course of most of the country. So I don't think that there's going to be a split on this. I think if any country under attack tends to rally around and support one another, I think that might even happen in the United States if that were going on right now. In fact, I said it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but nothing brings the people together than being attacked.
This presents a situation, an interesting situation concerning Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine immediately, very quickly, condemned the Hamas incursion into Israel and expressed their support for Israel. But Israel and Russia don't have any issues with each other. But Russia has been accused of getting drones from Iran. So how do you see this entire situation developing? And we have not really heard, I may be incorrect, but we've not really heard anything from the Russian government concerning this conflict.
I was going to say the same thing. We haven't heard a thing from Russia yet, and I think that the most likely thing you'll hear from Russia is that both parties ought to be talking to one another and so forth, because it will be towing us very carefully a political line. Russia and Israel do have communications. We can call it good, call it bad, but the fact is there's a very large Jewish population in Russia too, and it's an important population. So they've worked together on different areas. On the other hand, Russia has had traditional, especially of late, alliances with Syria, with Iran, and so forth. So Russia may find itself in a very difficult position, and probably feels that the less they say on this, other than we all should be talking together and so forth, the usual political thing is I think their most probable course of action. The Ukrainian Zelensky, I think, was probably, on one hand, a good political move, but in fairness, too, the Ukrainians lost their lives in this attack, too, apparently. So I think that he was both wise, and I think he was right to condemn the violence right away.
Indeed, not just the Ukrainians lost their lives, either lost their lives or missing are Americans, Britons, Cambodians, Philippine nationals, and I'm sure we'll find out more on this, the identities of those who are still missing as it develops. Now, Israel received support from the UK as well, from Rishi Sunak, who says that they stand with Israel and their right to defend themselves. But it presents also a predicament where in Israel's retaliatory attacks, we heard the Israeli IDF spokesman, or I should say a politician of one of the parties in Israel, a member of the Knesset, I shall say, who said that you say you support Israel now, and we appreciate you for doing so, but also support Israel further down the road, not just today or tomorrow or days from now, but from weeks from now, when there's pressure from other countries to say that sheath your swords. We don't want any fighting. We don't want any more escalation of the conflict. But Israel have a target, and they say that they want to eradicate Hamas. And the eradication of Hamas may not happen in a day or two or a week or two. So the United Nations, obviously, please
sorry,
go on.
Go ahead.
Please, you see my point, so go ahead.
I think it is probably, certainly it's difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate the entire Hamas movement. It permeates Gaza, it permeates the Palestinian Authority, I should say the Authority, PLA, but it certainly Hamas permeates Gaza, and so it's just going to be very, very difficult to eradicate. The other problem is that when you go after a group of people, what you do is you alienate all those people who are also aligned up to that point, and you create more enemies as well. Unfortunately, that is probably an inevitable part of retaliation. It just, particularly if you're believing in an eye for an eye. And so I think it's going to be very, very difficult to eradicate Hamas. I think most countries would like to see that, I wouldn't say happen, but I think that most countries would certainly like this to end. This has gone on for decades.
Okay, today's unprecedented nature of the events compels me to say, we're going to take a break, but we want you to stay with us. And when we come back after the break, we'll continue the conversation. Still ahead, rallies held in the United States for Israel and Palestine. Please join us again. Welcome back to today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine, with an added focus on the conflict in the Middle East concerning Israel in Gaza and Hamas. Residents of a Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza City searched through debris and moved people out of damaged buildings on Monday morning after the Israeli airstrike. One of the Israeli airstrikes, explosions have been seen across Gaza today as Israel launched retaliatory strikes against Hamas after the militant group launched a surprise attack the day before. Fighters from Islamist group Hamas killed 700 Israelis and abducted dozens more as they attacked Israeli towns on Saturday, the deadliest incursion into Israeli territory since Egypt and Syria's attacks in the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. According to Palestinian health officials, in response, Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have killed more than 400 people, including 20 children. The wounded and dead have arrived at the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City today after Israel pounded the Palestinian enclave of Gaza in retaliation for one of the bloodiest attacks in its history. The violence fueled volatility in global markets today, with oil prices rising, while several international air carriers have suspended flight services with Tel Aviv. There have been calls for restraint coming from world leaders following the attacks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday that 2 Ukrainian nationals have died in unrest in Israel and that more than 100 citizens have contacted the country's embassy. President Zelensky said he spoke on Sunday to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and expressed solidarity with Israel, which is enduring a brazen, large-scale attack. This latest global war seems to take the spotlight away from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which started in February 2022. Thousands of people have died with infrastructure destroyed in Ukraine. And now, staying with us is Mr. Stephen Hayes. Mr. Stephen Hayes is in the United States. Mr. Hayes, thank you for staying with us.
Yep, no problem.
So we have 700 Israelis died. We have according to the Hamas Palestinians, they say they have 163 hostages, 163. The Israelis say that it's about 100. That was as of yesterday. As of today, we don't know if that number is going to change. Why did Hamas take these hostages, do you think?
Well, I think it was probably as a bargaining chip. It wasn't just to take them for anything. I think the numbers that I read this morning were it's now over 1,000 Israelis have been killed and several hundred on the Palestinian side. But in any case, I think the reason is fairly clear. They're going to be used as bargaining chips for the next stage. And the next stage is that there will be some discussions. And as long as those hostages are held as such, there's going to be some leverage. We're going to those who are back in Israel right now are going to have to deal with that issue and protect the lives of the hostages. And certainly Hamas has proven that lives are fairly cheap right now.
But what does that say of the Hamas group? Because they know that there will be reprisals, instant reprisals from Israel. And according to the IDF spokesman, their strategy is that they have these tunnels in Gaza City, and they will spread these hostages in different areas in Gaza City underground. It's up to Israeli intelligence or negotiations to find out where these hostages are so they can extract them. So the layer of evil that is on top of the attack against Israel is the taking of these hostages and the sheer terror and the sheer horror that these children and women and vulnerable people are subject to it can only be left to the imagination. Let me finish. Sorry, Mr. Hayes. How can Hamas find sympathy with the United Nations when they have these hostages?
Well, I don't think they will find sympathy in that. At least I would hope not. And certainly Nigeria can relate to that too, given what Boko Haram has done at times as well. So Nigeria probably feels very strongly too in support of Israel on this to a considerable extent. I don't think you can find those hostages easily. You're not going to find all of them. If they do, I think it was a military victory and certainly a victory for Israeli intelligence, but they're going to be spread out, almost certainly. It's not going to be easy to find them, and so I think it's going to force negotiations. And now we also will find what the Hamas really wants. Some of it will probably be prisoners in Israel, but they now have a very strong bargaining chip, like it or not. Is it outrageous? Is it evil? Absolutely. And yet it now exists, and then we have to deal with it.
A member of the intelligence community says that with every ticking of the clock, with every passing hour, it's more difficult if the Israelis want to conduct a rescue operation, for them to successfully do this. Of course, remember the Entebbe raid and how valiant the Israelis are, how brave they are, and the resources at their disposal. But this particular situation, if anything, is a test for the Israeli intelligence agencies and the Israeli special forces, then this is it.
Well, it is. Entebbe was different in the sense that all the Israelis were in one spot. Also, it was even the general public knew where it was. They were there in the airport. So first of all, they were in the plane, then they were in the airport itself. So terminal. This is not the case here. They're going to be. I think you're right. I don't know. You don't know, but it's highly probable that the hostages will be spread out. I think that they won't. It's difficult to hide 127, 167, whatever the number of hostages, and not know where they are. So I think the natural, most likely scenario is that they're going to be spread out, and that's if they haven't already been. So I think that's going to be very, very difficult. And I think it's going to force, to some degree, at some point, negotiations. It would be outrageous if those hostages are killed, and even one. And we can only hope that that's not going to be the case, but I think it's going to force some degree of negotiations eventually, unless the Israelis are able to find them all at once. It's hard for me to imagine they're going to be kept in one place.
It's a developing story. The world is watching, the world is following it, and we hope it presents an outcome that will be favorable for the parties of peace and justice. And we thank you for the time you've spent with us this morning. Mr. Stephen Hayes, he's former president, American Center of International Leadership, and currently the partner of Gainful Solutions in Washington, D.C. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Looking at mediation efforts towards what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calls a war in Israel, U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner says it's too soon to determine how the attack by Hamas Israel unfolded, what possible role Iran may have played, or whether the attack was meant to derail the Saudi-Israeli normalization talks. Saturday's assault, the biggest incursion into Israel in decades, coincides with U.S.-backed move to push Saudi Arabia towards normalizing ties with Israel in return for a defense deal between Washington and Riyadh, a move that will slam the brakes on the kingdom's recent rapprochement with Tehran. Mr. Feiner says that the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden is looking into whether Iran may have been involved in the Hamas attack. On Sunday, New York locals gathered for a demonstration condemning Hamas attack on Israel. Hamas fighters rampaged through Israeli towns as the country suffered its bloodiest day in decades on Saturday. Israel battered Palestinians in return with airstrikes in Gaza on Sunday, with hundreds reportedly killed on both sides. The spiraling violence threatens to start a major new conflict in the Middle East. In the meantime, hundreds of Palestinian Americans and pro-Palestine supporters also marched in downtown Chicago, Illinois, calling for the U.S. government to stop being an ally to Israel. Protesters called on the international community to end its silence on Palestine, adding that U.S. citizens needed to raise their voices in support. Chicago and its suburbs are home to the largest Palestinian diaspora in the U.S. Families of missing Israelis are calling for answers from the government. About 30 missing Israelis attending a dance party that was attacked by gunmen emerged from hiding on Sunday, Israeli media reported, putting the death toll at the outdoor gathering at 260 people. People at the news conference say they tried to reassure their children by phone during the surprise attacks by Hamas. Uri David told the news conference he spent 30 minutes on the phone with his two daughters, Tair and Udaya, during the attack until they no longer responded to him, and he doesn't know where they are. Now, from there, we'll be showing you the moment when Al Jazeera English reporter Yuma Saeed was live from Gaza City. We'll try and show you this now. It occurred that he was live from Gaza City, an Al Jazeera English reporter. He was reporting from there when an Israeli missile struck the tower behind this individual on Saturday. Al-Saeed screamed, as you're seeing now, moved away, and then the impact noise was heard, and he was told to get to safety by his news crew and the channel.
On Palestine Tower, right in the middle of Gaza City. Take a moment, you and your team. Take a moment to breathe, okay? Just take a moment. All right. Yumna, please take cover. If you are in a position to do so safely, you can explain to us what we're happening. If you are not in a position to do so safely, then please get to safety.
No, it's okay. This is a missile attack on Palestine Tower, right in the middle of Gaza City.
Yumna, take a moment to breathe. Take a moment, you and your team. Take a moment to breathe, okay? Just take a moment as we are looking at this picture. We are hours into this war between Gaza and Israel, and we have just witnessed live what an Israeli air raid looks like on a populated area of Gaza City.
That was the incident involving the Al Jazeera reporter. You saw her. She was in shock, could barely get her words together, catch her breath after it happened as a result of that attack on Gaza by Israeli missile strikes as a consequence of the attack of Hamas militants in Israel. Pope Francis has called for an end to attacks and violence in Israel, saying terrorism and war will not solve any problems, but only bring further suffering and death to innocent people. The Pope said this in his weekly address to faithful in St. Peter's Square, that he's following with apprehension and sorrow what's happening in Israel. The Pope was saying that he is begging the attackers to cease and that the weapons shall cease, because it must be understood that terrorism and war bring no solutions. Finally, Ukraine's capital Kyiv also flashed Israel's national flag on advertising boards on signaling support after a surprise Hamas attack on Israel that is unraveling into full-scale violence in the region. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko had earlier that day announced that communal and private advertising boards in the capital will flash the Israeli flag at 8 p.m. local time in a show of support for Israel. Locals expressed their empathy for Israel and said they were horrified by what's happening. Other countries did the same thing. In Germany, there was a flash of the Israeli flag as well, and there has been a reinforcement of security in Israeli embassies in Germany, in France, and other nations around the world. That's it for today's coverage special of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching.